Welcome. In this video, I would like to talk about the position known as relativism. We'll have a look at both its moral and non-moral sense. We'll look at what the position itself is. We'll look at some of the reasoning behind the claim of relativism, and then we'll explore two or three criticisms of it. To begin, the relativist position is relatively simple. And sort of globally, the relativist claim is that there is no such thing as universal or absolute truths, propositions that are true for all cultures, all societies, across all time. So there are no universal truths. In particular, and what we're focusing on is the moral claims. So not just that there's no universal or absolute truth, but there's no universal or absolute moral truths. Moral truths for all cultures over all time, or that apply to all cultures over all time. Now, why would anybody make such a claim? One line of reasoning, frankly, stems merely from our common sense experience of the world. Especially being in a place like, say, Houston, we interact with many, many different cultural groups and types. And in our interactions with each other, there seems to be this notion that this culture, or this culture over here doesn't have any sort of real moral authority or right to interfere in other cultures. So, for example, it would seemingly be wrong for me to go into, say, a West African culture and start dictating moral behavior. You should do this, you should do that. And part of that reason seems to be because I would be judging another culture by the standards of my culture. And likewise for cross-cultural judgments. So there's that sort of common sense experience that we have. To take that a little bit further, we have the sort of anthropological thinking as well, which stems from this, but maybe goes a bit further. And it goes a bit further in its sort of observations, let's say. So not only do we have this sort of common sense view, but then you have the sort of sociological aspect where you get these sociologists, these ethnographers who will go into a culture and begin documenting a culture's beliefs, their behaviors, their rituals, their rites, and so on. What they believe, when they act a certain way, how they act a certain way, and so on. And what someone, say, like Ruth Benedict is going to talk about, and what she noticed. So in 1934 she came out with this book called Patterns of Culture. And within the first 2 pages in the introduction, she makes some, fairly significant claims. And one of those claims is that the standard of truth or falsity is set by the individual cultures. So that by the time you and I grow up in whatever culture it is, we have accepted the standards of truth or falsity that have been traditionally set by our culture. And so culture A, B, and C might believe similar things, and if they do, that's something like chance or whatever, but they don't necessarily believe the same things. And furthermore, that because each culture gets to set those standards, then truth now is relative to those cultures. So although proposition A might be true for culture X, and it would be true for them because they get to decide if it's true or false. Culture B gets to decide if proposition X is maybe false, and so on. So not only does our common sense experience tell us that it's sort of misguided to go into these different cultures and to pronounce judgments outside of the scope of our culture, anthropological and sociological evidence and reasoning tells us that that's also the case. And also justifies not just that I'm making a mistake by judging another culture, but that other cultures have an absolute right to judge or to make the judgment of what's true and what's false. They get to set the very standard of truth or falsity. Another line of reasoning, and this is just out of many, is good religious reason. I, like you, would be naive to ignore very strong religious sentiment. Some people are very, let's say, religious and take the mandates of their particular denomination or the mandates of the Bible or whatever holy book as being very important. So we can use this as one line of reasoning as well. So let's call it the religious perspective. So we had the common sense perspective, the anthropological perspective. Let's look at the religious perspective. In particular, let's look at the fundamentalist religious perspective. And what we mean by this is simply to say that being fundamentalist, someone would take the, say, Bible in this particular case, and its mandates as important, and that the Bible would be something like the literal Word of God, and one would need to listen to the commandments, not necessarily the 10 Commandments, that also, but just generally the commandments of the Bible. And so for such people, and we're going to mix this a little bit with our common sense, then if the Bible is going to claim something, then that becomes reason to believe it and then to subsequently act on it. So if you're anything like me, and I'm sure you are, then you grew up listening to people say things like, you shouldn't judge others, and so on. Judging others is wrong. And maybe mixed in with, a little bit of being tolerant and so on. And this ends up being a relativist claim. So, for example, if you were to open the Bible, Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, then you're going to read the following. Depending on which translation you have, judge not lest you be judged, or you shouldn't judge. And then it goes on to say something like, who are you to judge when you yourself have committed so many wrongs, and so on. And so the command is, don't judge. Now, presumably, the right of judgment would be for God. And one way of looking at this is to think, we humans, in our capacity, our great capacity to get things wrong all the time, especially our judgments of others, who would we be to make these judgments? Now let's just think sort of culturally here, and maybe outside of the religious context, just culturally, who would we be? What do we know enough about the world in order to make these moral judgments about other cultures and so on? Now, if we go back into the religious perspective and think of this, then it seems as if the role for judging would be by someone who would say know enough about, or something that would know enough in order to make these judgments. But on the human level, it would appear as if we would be making a mistake. And so, in the larger theological sense of judging, then of course it would be wrong for humans to make judgments. Of course, we can't talk about that, and that's not the point. The point is sort of, at the human level, how much do we know in order to actually make these judgments about other cultures? And I think that's sort of the lesson that we can take. And so if we were that type of person, we would take this seriously, and we might take that command to not judge seriously, and so we don't judge. Why? Because by what universal standards do I have, or do you have, in order to make that judgment? In the same book, Matthew, the same chapter 7, I believe it's verse 21, or it's going to be 20, something like that, right around there. You're told that you must listen to these commandments. And again, if you're that type of person, then this is further reason to listen to something like that. And so, don't judge. Why? Because truth is relative to individual cultures. There's no universal truth such that we can make these judgments pan-culturally, and so on. We could go on. There's lots of ways we can think about this. But let's just stop there. That's enough to sort of get things going. And let's have a look at now some criticisms of the position. Now I will say, you do have some of the arguments in the reading, and so you should be able to make out the arguments at this point. You have the premises, the conclusion. I'm going to leave that largely up to you. But it is there, and as I take you through in the reading, and as your other author takes you through in the reading, I think you can begin to make out how the argument works. But let's move on. Let's move on to some criticisms. I want to talk about the, let's call it the no absolute truth claim, and let's talk about the what I'll call the no judging claim, and then I'll add a couple of things in the end. Now let's look at the conclusion. The conclusion is there is no such thing as universal truth or universal moral truth. Let's have a look at what that claim means, and if we're willing to actually accept that conclusion, if we're willing to accept the consequences of that being true. Now, notice, if I were to say there is no such thing as truth, some of you might have heard this, some of you might have possibly even said this, then the question comes, presumably, the person who's saying that wants you to believe them. Wants you to believe what? To believe that it's true that there's no such thing as truth. If that's true, then of course, that undermines the very claim itself. That means there would be a universally true claim, and that claim would say that there's no such thing as truth. You should know this as a contradiction, which of course doesn't make any sense. So it becomes difficult to make that claim. And if we say there's no such thing as moral truth or falsity, then that claim itself is a claim about morality, about the structure of morality. And so there would be at least one true claim about morality. So not a claim of morality. So it's not a claim that says that you should or shouldn't do something, or that something is or is not wrong, but rather it's a more general claim about the very nature of morality itself. Again, this seems to undermine the point of making such claims. It's a contradiction. And as you should know, as you know, we did the reading, there's something strange about contradictions. They're in many ways unacceptable. They seem to undermine the notion of being reasonable itself. And if that's true, then that claim that there's no such thing as truth, or no such thing as moral truth, universal moral truth, if that's a contradiction, which it seems to be, then it seems to undermine the very point of being rational in the first place. I'm going to talk about another related aspect to that, but let's move on here. Let's move on to the no judging claim. So the claim is don't judge. And that if you're judging, or if you are a judger, then presumably you're doing something wrong. Now, in a similar vein, if that's true, that it's wrong to judge, then we have to recognize that that itself is a judgment. It is a moral judgment. And so not only do you get this sort of contradictory feel to it, such that it's true that you shouldn't judge, but it itself is a judgment. So it's the assertion of the very thing that it's trying to deny, that you shouldn't judge. And remember, you're the ones making the claim, and I'm the one making the claim, and your neighbor's the one making the claim. You shouldn't judge. So you are uttering that claim. And in uttering that claim, that is a judgment. It's a judgment about the other person, such that if they judge, then they're doing something wrong. That is a moral judgment. It's the assertion of the thing that it's trying to deny. And again, this spells trouble if we're trying to be reasonable. Now, of course, if you're not trying to be reasonable, then you can say whatever you want. But then again, you've given up on the notion of truth or falsity. So if we're concerned with these sorts of things, then contradictions should matter to us. And then both of these claims that there's no such thing as universal truth and that you shouldn't judge seem wrong. We should be concerned with that. And if they're wrong, then presumably we throw them out. And this leaves us with the propositions that there is universal moral truth, and it's okay to judge. Now, the trick, of course, is to begin to judge responsibly. And so even though there's no contradiction involved in the notion that it's okay to morally judge, doesn't mean that it's easy to make the judgments. We still get caught up in our biases and our emotional lives and our sentiments and the things we want and so on. And this all clouds our judgments. So even though it might actually be okay to make moral judgments, it doesn't mean that we don't have our work cut out for us in beginning to make proper judgments. But at least one step getting closer to that is to realize that the claim that it's wrong to judge is false. It is okay to judge. We need to judge properly. And of course that takes a lot of work. Another step is to realize that there is nothing wrong with claiming that there's universal truth. We're not necessarily saying what that truth is, and we're not necessarily going to either. That's not the point right now. The point is to open up the possibility of moral truth or falsity, whereas before maybe it might have been closed off. Those are two very important steps when it comes to thinking about morality and moral positions. But the relativist claim isn't entirely bankrupt. There are some aspects of it that we can take away. And one of those aspects is the notion of tolerance. The relativist claim, especially from a sociological or an anthropological position, one reason to make that claim is because when we are gathering our data, we want to try to be as unbiased as possible. So we collect proper data. As we all know, when our biases interfere with our interaction of the world, then it can skew the data. And we get false representation and so on. And again, if truth or falsity is our goal, then we want to limit that. We want to put a limit on some of our biases. And so we might adopt the attitude of tolerance in order simply to gather data. But of course this extends much further to our dealings with each other on a larger societal level. It's good to be tolerant. Not too tolerant, right? You don't want to tolerate everything. Certainly that has very poor consequences. But certainly tolerance is a good thing when we look at the influence, say, cultures have in terms of what we know about the world. Being tolerant can actually increase our knowledge. Being tolerant can increase our pleasure and experience of the world. In lots of ways, in terms of food, friendship, art, music, technology, and so on. So we say something like tolerance is a good thing. And certainly relativism promotes that line of reasoning as well. But again, we need to be sort of reasonable about this, and we need to think through the claims. And this is why we look at relativism first, because it is seen as a intellectual threat, something that impedes our ability to even do morality in the first place. Okay, that'll do it for this. I hope this helps, and as always, my door is open. A couple of you have actually come to see me already. My door is always open. Give me a message, let me know you're coming. Maybe I can stick around, maybe we can set up an appointment. But as always, my door is open, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.